This
So
meeting is being recorded.
Meeting is being recorded.
This meeting is being recorded.
So today we're talking about ethics.
Ethics.
And it always is amazing to me how anytime you talk about something like this, it's amazing how much life gives you opportunities to be able to use as examples. On a regular basis, there are ethical questions that are out there. This week, the one that was interesting to me was the parish up in Phoenix, a parish I'm really familiar with. It's called St. Gregory Parish, and I used to actually deliver bread on the backside of that parish to a little grocery store that was over there. And the pastor there, who's been there for more than 20 years doing baptisms, got in trouble because he's been saying, "We baptize you," instead of "I baptize you." And the larger church said, none of these things for 20 some years are now valid. None of these baptisms. Now,
I wondered I heard that there was a mistake in words and people weren't baptized, but I didn't hear what the mistake was. I'm glad to know.
It was just "we," and for him it was "we."
Big deal.
This,
Gee whiz.
yeah. For him it was "we," this priest and this mother, this father, this grandmother, this Godfather, all the people there, this church, that we are baptizing you. And the word is "I" because it's God who does the baptism. And I get the theology behind that, but then they said that everything's invalid for 20 something years. I have a harder time with that. Right? But those are the types of things we get into. Is what is it that we're emphasizing? What is it we're seeing? What is it we're having to deal with as we walk through life? What is the right ethical thing to do?
And from my teacher perspective on this, my English teacher perspective, I understand, because we always agreed, we English teachers, that pronouns were the most difficult things to deal with in our language quivers. Oh golly.
But
It shouldn't evolve an entire series of
and that's a real good example of what's wrong with the church. How would Borg feel about that?
Right, I agree with you. And the thing of it is that it's that type of thing that even while I understand why a church might say that it's God who baptizes, not us. I get the theology of that. Still, the ethical implications of what it means and how it affects this couple who came in last week with the best of intents and got their baby baptized, suddenly it's different. Or the one who's the baby who's now 25 years old, right? And is being told what they've thought was true about them forever is not. Ethics have some wide-ranging effects like that. And it all comes down to the question that Bishop Spong asked in the very first chapter of the Unbreakable book, the very first ethics chapter. He said, "From where does the human sense arise that some things are good and others are evil?" Right? Just that idea of how do we define that space of good and evil, and why is that even important? So that we have to say this is a ethically good place, this is an ethically wrong place.
Well, I think that the discussion about that the baptism is kind of irrelevant. So that's just crazy. Why waste your time even talking about it? Well, you're forced to because of a hierarchy, and hierarchies get stuck.
Yeah, but Don, if you take it to the not dissimilar situation that we are dealing with in Methodism, when we merged back in 1969, we merged with another church. We came together, and they wrote up a piece that was about kind of about how what were souls about, right? And in the midst of that, and it was passing with everybody on board until somebody said, let's just modify it with just a simple phrase in here. Homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teachings. And now, how many years past 1969 are we? Right? We are still arguing about that line and haven't found a space to be able to live together. In fact, we're at the most dire place we've ever been with that. Because some of those decisions we make ethically can divide us tremendously. Think about something like abortion. One of the most divisive, all across America, one of the most divisive issues. And what's interesting about that is that there's a scale called the Kohlberg scale of moral awareness or something. And on that scale, which is a 0 to 5 or something, both the pro-life and pro-choice stances are very high ethically. Now, you notice I put the pro-choice place a little higher because that's kind of where I'm at. But the reality is you could argue back and forth, but you know what we typically do when we look at abortion is we take the other person's things and put them way down here and say, look how I'm in the moral high ground and they're in the moral low ground. And yet they're really right about here.
And the so-called pro-life people, they're for like the death penalty, and they're for guns, and they're for killing all sorts of adult people rather than fetuses. That's one of the things that bothers me about them.
And against child tax credits, and so
yes.
their interest in caring for children is rather limited.
Yeah,
exactly.
Well,
right.
and that's always one of the challenges for all of us, because like on death issues, you're right, on death penalty, where this one is yes on abortion, a death issue, it flips. Who's for life and who's for death changes on those two issues. And so it's hard for all of us to be consistent.
Correct.
Because we make one choice for different reasons than we make the other choice. One stance differently. And we often, Don, like you were pointing out, don't see a larger picture. The church is trying to protect its way of doing something in that baptism ritual. But at what cost? And we often don't ask that question.
The other ethical thing that was in the news this morning was this business about taxpayer money going for vouchers for private schools. What about putting the money into the public schools so they're improved?
Yeah, I don't have a hard time with taxpayer money going to charter schools. I have a hard time with this many years later, charter schools not having as many limitations, restrictions, hoops to have to jump through as typical public schools, and then saying, well, we're much better than you guys are. Well, then let everyone else out of those restrictions that you don't want to have.
Yes. Well, I meant religious schools rather than the charter schools are not religious.
Sometimes they are.
Are they? Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Sometimes they are. A charter school could be formed under just about any reason, and it got to write themselves out of some of the rules that they thought was going to get in the way of their reason. So why can't a public school do that? If that's a bad reason, if that's not helpful, why don't we take it out of the loop? But those
one of the
ahead.
other things I saw in today's paper that I thought you were going to raise, because you were comparing abortion and killing with gun control and so forth, is that one of the issues now is to discontinue taxes on guns. And I just was overcome by thought that not only that people somehow can buy a gun and not pay taxes on it. Oh my God, that one just didn't make any sense to me.
Well, Kay, you must have also seen the one about the company that is now producing a AK-15, a junior AK-15. It's marketing to young people, basically.
Oh
And
my goodness.
again, it's like, really?
Yeah.
It was
But-
so awful. It's just so awful.
But that's because those things which we take as being ethically okay, we tend to take away barriers to that. Okay,
Yeah,
so I'm
I
not trying to
actually-
make.
Before this discussion, I actually hadn't compared abortion and gun control in the same sentence, but they really do belong there. That was a very good comparison because they're killing.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
that was, or death penalty or anything like that. So
Yeah.
war.
right. And
War,
and,
what a war.
Okay, sounds good.
and that's the hard part, is that we sometimes disagree about different things, and we disagree for a whole lot of different things. If we look at war, sometimes people are there because of fear of whoever the enemy is and the defense that needs to be there. Sometimes people are there because, well, that's the industry that feeds my family. That's where I get my paycheck from. Sometimes people are there for even worse reasons than that, right? But all of those things make it so that they look at war very differently than I would look at it as a relatively dedicated anti-war, anti-military person.
Yeah. What we're really doing is talking about one of the 10 commandments, which is thou shalt not kill. And of course, that was the theme of much of what we read. And so that's very interesting to include, war and abortion in the same discussion. I'm liking that. And of course, the death penalty. And yeah, I'm anti-war and anti-military too. I still have great respect for Costa Rica that can maintain itself as a surviving republic
Yes.
on its own and does not have an army.
If and this is a big if I understand how Spong was answering the question that you raised, Jim, about, so if we don't have hard and fast rules like the 10 commandments, how do we determine what is ethically right and wrong? And again, if I understand, he seemed to be saying that what elevates life, what respects love and respects the individual and the community, that those are the standards by which we judge ethical behavior. But then I would submit, if my understanding is correct, I would submit that those questions would also be answered differently by different people.
They would.
Those who support abortion and those who oppose abortion each feel that they are doing what is ethically right by that standard, I think.
Mm-hmm. So let me kind of speak to that by telling you about a conversation that happened on a pastor page, right? Where we're talking about all kinds of different pastoral type of things, and this one was specifically looking at John Shelby Spong and his writings. And so this person asked this question, says, when we give up on the idea of a theistic God, what are we left with? Life was simpler when I pictured a being in the sky that just dictated the stuff to us. So what am I left with without that very readily made? And that's why we like the 10 Commandments. You know my joke about the 10 Commandments, don't you? We like the 10 Commandments because every day I can just go, checklist, checklist, checklist. Got 9 out of 10 of them right. That's an A. I just killed that one guy today. I'm still a good guy. Right? It's a simple, easy way to be able to define ourselves in the good instead of questioning ourselves. And at least part of what ethics should do is not question that other person, It should put us in that space of questioning and figuring out, what do we do? So I answered him and I said, for me, the dropping of that theistic God means that sometimes if we're left with too much certainty, do we define God out of the equation? So a theistic God might be safe and understandable, but is it truly God? And I think that's what we often have done. Does God care if the priest says I or we to determine if a person is baptized? I don't think so.
So
Go ahead.
what, to me, it's a question, is God easily defined or is God a mystery?
Yeah.
And when
That's
you just put God up there in the sky, you've lost the mystery. And I think mystery is the only answer, because I just don't believe a lot of those people that tell me that they know the answers.
Yeah. But we love to be able to do that. You know, my profession in some ways is about giving people answers where they haven't had answers before. And sometimes we have perfected that side of the profession. Let me have all the right answers and tell you what to think and feel and believe. And that's not our best ethical space to be in, but we often take that space, don't we? Our best way to do it is to bring up questions and trust each other. But isn't that the hard part about ethics? Because we often, especially if we're in an oppositional space with someone else, we don't trust the person ethically on the other side of that question, do we? Which is why in abortion, we write the other person as really evil, not look at them and say, let me see if I can understand your ethical position.
I find that sometimes that challenge is more on myself. That when I feel like I've done something wrong, that, you know, forgiving myself is sometimes a challenge.
Yeah, yeah.
And I wonder about the person or persons who reported that pastor had been using the wrong words. I mean,
Yeah, how did they find out?
if that's
Yeah,
not
right.
straining at gnats and swallowing camels, I don't know what is. It's like, and the same thing goes for pastors being called up in the Methodist Church for doing same-sex weddings. Who are the persons who are so righteous to tell about, you know, to tattletale? I mean, it's like, why would they do that? Why?
But it could be, if you define this is where things need to be in order to be in the space where God is at and to bring us to the space where God is at, then you start identifying how to weed out that which doesn't belong. I was amazed in the whole marriage question around gay and straight, right? How much it became if we let them get married, then we'll destroy marriage. Now, what sense does that make? I think each couple makes it so that either they've preserved marriage or destroyed marriage. Somebody else doesn't do that for you, do they?
Well, they do if you're still concerned about tribalism. And that's what ethics, I think, at the bottom of it comes to. It's more about the question than the answer, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. But when we hold on to, and I love that.
I want him to go say more, Jeff. I don't quite know what you're saying.
Me either.
The things that separate us ethically are not or should not be those things that we can agree are the correct answers to any ethical conundrum, but the correct question. We're called to think about what we are saying and asking. And it's in that we reach an understanding. It is in that we reach an understanding of our opposite member, our opposite tribe. And I think that's what we're called to do.
For example, can you give an example?
Let's see.
Well, maybe Jim gave an example a minute ago when he said about talking to somebody who is against abortion. Tell me what is the sort of ethical basis that you.
That would be an example.
Let me give you another example that I think might fit, and you can decide. One of the easiest of the 10 commandments to understand is thou shalt not kill. Pretty simple, right? Thou shalt not kill. And yet it's very simple to try to cheapen that by making it a smaller question. So a lot of people say, oh, that word really means murder.
Mhm.
And why is that an easier word? So that then if they're for the death penalty, that killing, well, that's justifiable killing. War is justifiable killing. That's not covered by thou shalt not kill. What it's supposed to, I think, do is thou shalt not kill is supposed to question us anytime we step into that space where we have to kill. And so the vegan who says, I choose not to eat animal because that means an animal is being killed, is using, I think, a good questioning aspect of thou shalt not kill. And when somebody else just makes fun of them, I don't think they're letting it penetrate as easily or as well. So do we cheapen the question by having an answer? I think that's what you're saying, Jeff, right?
I think that's an important part of it. Yes. Yeah. Yep.
And in abortion, the question, of course, is, are they alive?
Right. And I think that that's the type of place where we really need to talk to each other. But because both sides have such firm answers, we no longer talk. We haven't talked for decades about abortion. We have just fought. Haven't we?
Mm-hmm.
And we pick up readily available answers that fit our agenda. For example, the Texas abortion law, anti-abortion law, that says heartbeat at 6 weeks of age of gestational period. That's why that baby's already alive, and yet medical experts will say that's not a heartbeat you're hearing at 6 weeks. And yet they don't have to listen to that because they've got an answer already. And so you no longer have a question that you're trying to discover together.
There we go.
So I think that many times there's a argument or a fight between two people, and at least one of the persons it's really an issue that they haven't even brought up. So the issue is something else. The issue is something with you that I'm angry about, and I'm going to use this argument over here that has nothing to do with what I'm really angry about. So I think that's one of the things that happens, and I think that's a big thing that's going on now between so-called conservatives and so-called progressives.
Yeah, very often, Don, it comes down to, if you're not acting like me, then you must be evil.
So whatever you believe, I'm going to be against.
Very often, that's exactly right. And we use that to further the divisions between us. And at least part of what ethics is that which draws us into community even when we disagree. And we try to figure that out.
So I think a big part of ethics is honesty. And sometimes we don't even see our own dishonesty.
Yeah. Because we use it to have answers rather than to be honest with each other.
I'd use the term integrity.
Integrity is a good word too. Julia, you were going to say something.
Well, just along these lines, I think, and back to the idea of abortion, and again, thinking that sometimes we just get into our silos, but we don't try to talk about what is the goal here, what is the objective, and if it is life, in the case of abortion, then why can't we have, I've often wondered why we aren't having more conversation around how do we make abortion less of a choice? I mean, less of a choice that someone needs to or feels they need to or wants to make by providing the support systems, the assistance, the help that might make it possible for, and even desirable for, a woman to carry a baby to full term, but then know that she has options at that point for how to proceed.
Or to not get pregnant in the first place.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I forget if it was my Ms. Magazine or my Mother Jones today was talking about having birth control vending machines in the universities so that the kids could get birth control easily.
Yeah.
Well, and
Yeah.
I've seen ads where the bathrooms, men's and women's, have free
yes?
condom machines. And a
Uh-huh.
lot of people are opposed to that, but I think that's just a super idea.
And of course,
Well,
that's another thing that where one of the biggest denominations that opposes abortion also opposes birth control. I mean, excuse me.
Yes.
Another thing.
Good point.
And that was part of the question that I think Dr. Spong really pushed hard on, is if we're going to have a longer period between sexual maturity, right, at 12 or 13, whenever you hit puberty, and whenever it is that now we are getting married, which is what now, mid-20s?
Mhm.
Or late 20s, yeah.
Sometimes late 20s, then we've got to figure out what else do we do? And is expecting a child to have no sex for 13 years a fair expectation, or what else do we do? And you know why
It's
things
a
like
joke.
and you know why things like the Catholic, you know why the church is opposed to things like condoms, birth control? Do you know where that
No.
stems from?
No.
No.
Be
A
fruitful and
concept from what?
The phrase "be fruitful and multiply."
No.
No, I think it believes that it encourages sexual activity.
I think that's part of it. But
There's
that's not
plenty
where
of studies that show that it doesn't.
I think that's part of it, but that's not where it started from. It started from the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, if you will, which were not our best thoughtful space. And the belief at that point was in what was called a homunculoi. Homunculoids were little teeny human beings that were in sperm, so that all of the genetic material of that child actually came from the sperm of the father, and that the woman contributed none of that genetic material, right? And so they're little teeny human beings, and so they are already alive, okay? And you can't kill those homunculoids.
Oh my goodness.
So we're dealing with
Well, if they all stay alive, a woman's gonna have an awful big litter.
an awful big litter is right. And so for us to continue to hold on to something from the Middle Ages ought to be questioned, and yet it's not. We are in a very different space. Then even when we were born, we're in a very different space. What is needed today versus what was needed 50 or 100 or 1,000 years ago should be questioned.
There's another ethical question that is generally ignored, and that is, there's how many people today? 6 or 7 billion people.
Mhm.
And it was half that when I was born, probably. That the displacement of all the wildlife and the displacement of where animals can live. No one's talking about that. That's a great ethical question that I see that we've avoided. So it's just fine for us humans to displace all the other animals, but we better not, a woman better not have an abortion. It just, to me, it's crazy.
Yeah, but to do that, we have to be in conversation with each other, seeking community rather than throwing right answers at each other. And much of Western civilization, and read into that, much of Christian civilization has been about having the right answer and beating each other over the head with our right answer rather than being in the conversation. One of the things I love about the Jewish faith and their relationship to the commandments. You know how many commandments they recognize in the Old Testament?
7.
About 160 something?
613.
713.
613. And they go back and forth about talking about why is this important or why is it outmoded, or and so they have conversations about it rather than a firm, here's the 10 commandments and you have to follow them. Instead of giving themselves right answers, they sit in conversation about it. Why have we decided not to be in conversation any longer?
It's messy.
Lose
Yeah.
power.
Yeah.
And we already have the right answers. Why do we need to
Right.
think about it?
Right. And much of the study of ethics, and it's a huge field, and it is studied a lot, but you know where it's studied? In academic circles rather than in religious circles. Why have we decided to sell that part of what I think is our job as religious people over to just academics? Not that academics do a poor job of doing that. I think academics should do that as well. But for us not to, we've lost something important, haven't we?
True.
And I remember actually in a church that we attended in upstate New York, we had our local congressman at the time, Barbara Conable, who is a Republican, come in to talk. And I remember he talked about trying to do the right thing. And he made quite an argument for the right thing wasn't always easy to decide, because there were various shades of, and often something was right in this area, but it then created some other problem over in this area. So that's another issue. And I also think, maybe not exactly related, but it's interesting that we have these conversations about religion and what the Bible had to say and following that, and trying to argue that, well, but you have to consider the times and the context and whatnot. We're sort of doing the same thing politically with the Constitution, aren't we? Because there are people who are very strict constitutionists and believe that how it was written exactly, that's what you do today, despite the fact that it was written in a very different time. And others argue.
And that it was written in order to be amended.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. It wasn't written to be a static document. It was written to be a living document. But you're right that even some of our Supreme Court justices, what's his name, Scalia, that just died, he was one who wanted to just go back to just a strict, originator document.
Scalia,
right?
Yeah.
Scalia, yeah.
We once listened to a presentation by a constitutional scholar at a class we were taking at the U of A. Kamarinsky. And he mentioned something about the Constitution not being just that document. And somebody piped up in the class and said, that's absolutely correct, because it does float on a whole huge pile of case law. Established, adjudicated thought positions, resulting in a change to that document. So for those people, even someone like Scalia, to say, no, can't possibly change, it's going to be just the same. is either fallacious or mendacious or completely silly.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm
It's
thinking,
just-
Well-
sorry, I've just
Go
been
ahead.
thinking it's not so much about finding the right answer, but the answer that you can live with. And
The answer that we can live with, I think, is maybe even a better one.
right. And sometimes that changes. I got to go and read to kids today. I'm so excited. I had such a good time. And at that school, they have a child in a wheelchair who's non-communicative. Some people would say that's a waste of money to have that person in with normal kids. And yet it's, for me, it's perfect. I mean, the kids who are communicative need to realize that this other person is equally as human as they are, and they'll never get that unless they have contact with that person. So, but I have known people who, you know, and I grew up when anybody with that kind of disability just wouldn't even be seen.
Yeah.
There were no
Yeah.
Down syndrome people on the street that I ever saw as a kid. I don't know where they were, but they weren't public. And they certainly weren't in public school with me.
My first year teaching first grade, teaching just first graders, I was all the way down at the end of the hallway because, everyone else wanted the closer rooms to the lunchroom and things. But the last room in the hallway was the severe handicapped room. And we shared an outside door, and Colleen would sometimes crawl in, and Colleen was severely mentally and physically challenged, and she would crawl into our classroom, and my little first graders would see her, and she was a big kid. She was even big for the eighth grader that she was, but they knew her, and I think that was really great that oftentimes we walked down to that lunchroom together, because they got to see children that were different than, but they got to experience and have them be part of their life. And I think that sometimes we do ethics in the way that it makes it convenient for us.
Mhm.
But at least part of the ethical question is what is it that makes the world the best possible? And that's a huge question, because there's all kinds of things there. A couple of weeks ago, I asked the question of, what's better, to have a quiet space on a mountain or to have a road through that mountain to connect communities? Both of those have good goals, but they can be at odds with each other, right?
Yeah.
But the only way that becomes the best question is if the people with the different goals come together and they figure out what might fulfill both goals, which you'll never do perfectly, but maybe you get to some degree.
Mhm.
But how many have at least some difficulty talking to some of those people that are opposed to you?
Especially today. Again, I attribute a lot to our former president, that I think, for me anyway, made conversation with people who support him very difficult. Although I had disagreements with George W. But I would be able to talk to people about that or
And go out and have a beer with them.
But somehow these days it's become a real challenge to, and sometimes I attribute anyway to an idea of character. It's about the character of the man, not about policies but I just felt like his behavior was so abhorrent to me that anybody who accepted him seemed like, how could you do that?
Sure. And I think what you're talking about, Julia, is you don't trust those people who did that like you did before. And
well, because I do, and that makes me question their values, you know. It makes
yeah,
me
absolutely.
question
But I think that they have some of that same non-trust with you. Now, I
exactly.
don't know how they get to that, why it is that they look at who you are and the wonderful person that you are, and they get to non-trust with you. But I feel like that's what they're at, where they're at. They look at us and they don't trust.
Well,
And we don't trust them.
I don't have any trouble talking to those people, but some of them have trouble talking to me.
Mhm.
So I don't know whether what I'm saying is true or a joke, but yeah,
Anybody else have trouble talking to Don?
it works both ways.
Yeah, but at least part of this is trying to figure out how to get past all those, and they're not small issues sometimes. The reasons why we don't trust, the reasons why we've given each other to be suspicious of are sometimes huge, right? And yet at least part of ethics is trying to be in conversation.
So I may even have trouble talking to my brother and one of my sons, but I can listen to them. So that's one of the things I do is listen.
So let me tell you a story that I think is indicative of what goes on. I was at a meeting up at St. Matthew's Church, which is kind of in, it's in the Mesa area, just kind of off of the 60. And all of a sudden somebody came in, you know, kind of like that frantic look in their face. And there were 4 pastors there. And he said, I need a pastor. So they sent him over to our table and we're talking to them. And it says, we're sitting over at the golf course and our pastor who was supposed to come and marry us didn't show up. Can anyone do that? And immediately Pastor Dwayne spoke up and said, nope, I don't do any marriage unless I've done X number of premarital sessions. That's an ethical standard. I get that. I don't think it was helpful at all in the moment. But that's the type of thing that we often do, is we set up our thing as hard absolutes. Now, I'd love to meet the couple ahead of time, but I said, I'm going over there. So I went over there, ended up being an off cousin of mine from the Round Valley area. I'm so happy that I was able to say yes and be in that space with them and give them grace instead of. But it means you might have to bend your ethical standard and sit in the situation differently than what you might have. Maybe premarital counseling is better, but is it a hard no? And we do a lot of hard no's with our ethical standards, don't we?
Didn't Spong use the word situational, that sometimes ethics is situational, basically?
Yeah, which of course your 10 commandment type of people want it to be non-situational. They want it to be hard and fast God rules.
They don't want to succumb to subjectivity, as I remember.
Yeah. But that comes down to trust. Why is it that they don't like situational ethics? Because you make choices in the situation differently than I would make.
Well, and it requires decision-making without prescription.
Yeah. And it's much simpler to say, if A happens, then you have to do B.
Right.
But Jim, I don't think you bent your ethics when you did the marriage.
I don't mention ethics, but part of that is because my view of marriage. Some people think that they have to protect marriage because they own marriage. And usually that means the church that they belong to owns how marriage should happen. I think a couple owns their marriage. And the owns their relationship, and the church can be invited in. The municipal government can be invited in to make it official, but the relationship ultimately belongs to that couple. Dwayne was a type of person who was much more about, let me tell you the right answer. And so he had to instruct those folks in the marriage so that they did marriage his way. I've learned that people don't listen to the pastor's premarital counseling that much. They do marriage their way.
Why would they?
I may have really good ideas, but sometimes they're better to be listened to after you're struggling with each other than when you're in the middle of love and trying to get married. So, the thing about ethics is it's huge and it's broad, and we could bring up a million other ways of doing something, right? But at least a lot of it comes down to, are we in conversation with each other? That we take responsibility to be in that space and actually talk to each other about it. One of the things about gay marriage is it's become really simple to be able to say that that's not good, right? I went to seminary with a young lady who, it was interesting when I got to know her. I also met her wife, and wife came from the same background as I come from, Mormonism. She'd been severely beaten by that very patriarchal religion and the man who she had married. So maybe she was driven into homosexuality by that poor experience. But I got to tell you that here was my experience. The marriage she was in and the woman that she was in love with was the savior of what was wrong about that church that I'd come out of and the patriarchy that it espoused. So whatever is right or wrong about the homosexual question, what I knew is that she was in a safe place. And for me to ask her to move would have been the height of non-ethical behavior. And yet I think we often make that type of thing. We put up a hard and fast rule, and then we make someone move to that rule, whether or not it's really the best thing for them or not. Does that make sense?
Very
Yes,
much.
it does.
Yeah.
How do we help? How do we be in relationship enough to know what is the right place right now? That's situational ethics, but that's deep relationship, isn't it? So maybe that's a better way to say it. It's relational ethics, not situational ethics.
I like that word.
Here we go.
Maybe it's both.
Maybe it's both. Because we should listen to the situation as well as the people that are in it, shouldn't we?
And I think there are a lot of people, I don't know a lot. I think there are people who are not, they don't feel safe unless they have clear parameters around themselves, rules to follow and that kind of thing. And so then they're not comfortable until they've put somebody else in a box too. So it's,
That's a good point.
so that kind of helps me with people who are so adamant about things, is that they're inside a box to keep themselves safe rather than to make me mad.
Good
But the
observation, Judy.
box would not be comfortable for me.
But to be able to recognize the box and why they have it is a good thing. You're right, Judy.
Well, it helps me not to be quite so mean to them.
Yeah, yeah, or dismissive. You know, I've got the hard part about the last couple of years for me politically is I just don't even want to talk to. I'm tired of the non-listening on that side. And yet we need that listening even more than ever, don't we? We need that relationship right now in tremendous ways.
When that James Jones thing happened 1,000 years ago, I can't remember how long ago now, but all those people willingly died or seemingly willingly died. Someone said to me in the face of that, isn't it interesting that so many people would prefer death to ambiguity? That they were so uncomfortable with ambiguity that they chose to leave this world rather than to live with the ongoingness of switching and the relational thing. And that's really stuck with me.
Yeah. And yet here's the thing, Judy, most of the things that we do in life change on a pretty regular basis. So we've been talking about marriage. That has changed tremendously in my lifetime. All right. My father's generation was the generation that they got married and they stayed together no matter what. No matter what, right? And how many knew at least somebody in that generation who they were hurting each other horribly and yet they were staying together? Do you know why they did that? Because the generation before, my grandparents' generation, had the largest rate of abandonment ever that I know of. They were abandoning their spouses on a regular basis for a lot of different reasons. It was the Great Depression, and so they were having to go all the way across country. While they were over there, years later, they found somebody else, and so they never came home. And so my parents' generation said, we're going to stay together no matter what. My generation, in response to that, saw you guys are staying together too much when you shouldn't. And so we got way too good at divorcing and not staying together, not even giving it enough of a chance. So my kids' generation, you know what they do in response to our poor choices?
They don't get
married.
They don't get married. Right? And so
What a
each
great
generation,
decision.
yeah, each generation has taken the same thing and responded to the generation before and seen it very differently. None of those is a necessarily wrong ethical choice, but it's also informed by a very different precedent that allows it to be them to look at things very differently than what the generation before did.
And they're even adopting new pronouns to get back to what Jeff was talking about.
Absolutely. And so we have to try to, as much as possible, help each other not to have undeniable, firm, non-questioned answers. At least part of what ethics is about is to be in conversation and to try to learn to trust the other people in that conversation.
I don't know if this makes sense or not, but what's coming up for me is the human animal is so driven by fear, especially when it comes to epic answers. The human being is so driven by fear that that's how all of his ethics are based on what's safe, what keeps me safe. And for me, the difference between being afraid of answers or being afraid of questions identifies the challenge that people have.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Well, the good news is that if you wanted questions, there's still a whole lot of them out there for you.
Uh,
But I got to tell
I'm
you
more
that,
comfortable with questions than I'm at. Answers have been a challenge in my life. Questions
Yeah.
have been interesting in my life.
I got to tell you though, one thing that gives me great hope is the people that I'm looking at on this screen, because you guys sit in that space better than most. Keep doing that. Keep moving towards
Even
the
Don?
even done. keep doing that. We will get to some of those better spaces, but it does take time.
And thank you to you and St. Francis for helping us along that path.
Providing a space where we can do that.
Exactly.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. I
This
think St. Francis
discussion
is,
group has
Don
been
also.
wonderful.
all right, my friends,
Oh,
thank you for your time today.
prayer.
Next week, we are talking about prayer, and there are only about 15 or 20 chapters and or books about it.
I got
Bye,
through all of
Dr.
them this
Spong.
week.
So have fun reading about that, and I will see you in a week. And next week, like I said, I will be in person if all goes according to plans, but I will have this in place so that people can come in electronically if they would rather. All right.
Thank you.
Take
Thank
care, my
you.
friends.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Be well.
Bye.
Be healthy.
Better.